Hi guys, hold on for a second. Before we proceed to the video, I have something very important to tell you. Professor Jon V. Kofas has published his new book in collaboration with Little French Media, and the title of the book is Neoliberalism, Inequality, and Authoritarianism. This book details how neoliberalism impacts the geopolitical economy in the 21st century. You can buy it from Amazon and the link is in the description. Thank you. Now let's proceed to the video.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to a presentation on Israel's relationship, rather antagonistic one, of course, historically, not just recently, with the United Nations. What I would like to explain in this session is that the relationship, the confrontation relationship between Israel and the United Nations is in part structural. It has to do with the fact that the United Nations is designed in such a way that its job, its task of enforcement, as its members have pointed out repeatedly, especially during the recent September meeting of the UN, uh, makes it very difficult to have the resolutions, whether it's anything from the General Assembly or the Security Council. The structure of the United Nations, of course, was designed, as we will see, deliberately so that the great powers, with the US leading the charge, have a much bigger voice. This is universal than the rest of the world, by the way, the rest of the members. This is universally recognized. This is a complaint by the global south. This issue has come up historically. It came up during the September 2024 meeting. So this is not a secret. Now, here are some general themes I want to touch upon, and then I'm going to go through this very brief history of the UN, how it came about, and we can see why it is that Israel and the United Nations have had historically a confrontational relationship. First of all, the role of the United Nations is to enforce its mission and to make sure that its various sub-agencies do their work and follow the conventions of the United Nations. Whether it is the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, both of those, of course, have been involved in rendering rulings on Israel, as people know very well, in 2024, or whether it's the Human Rights Council, an arm of the United Nations, or the humanitarian relief, one of the humanitarian relief agencies like UNIFIL, the UN interim force in Lebanon, recently, of course, involved in controversy with Israel because the IDF, Israel's military, has been targeting peacekeepers in southern Lebanon, namely United Nations peacekeepers who have been there since March 1978, okay, since Israel invaded Lebanon. So that is one issue. The UN is there to defend itself as an organization, the integrity of the organization, to carry out its mission, okay, to do its work. The other issue is that the United Nations is obligated by the Convention of 1949, okay, to protect the human rights of Palestinians. It's obligated to protect those rights. The United Nations is seen by those siding with Israel as an entity affording legitimacy to the Palestinians. This is at the core of the confrontation. One issue that is at the core of the confrontation. Affording legitimacy to the Palestinian people would lead them to agreeing that a two-state solution, a UN proposal going back to 1947, is a legitimate goal and one supported by most countries around the world, even those like the United States, although the US supports it more in rhetoric to placate those favoring it. Okay. So the issue of legitimizing, the rights of the Palestinian people in accordance with the 1949 Convention, that is a very important one. Another issue is Israel's side. We have heard it, people have heard it a million times. You hardly have to be even reading a newspaper or watching TV. The world knows there is one defense that Israel uses, and that is the right to self-defense. This would be tantamount, as we will see, to the South African regime before Nelson Mandela was freed from prison, arguing that the white majority has the right to self-defense against the black majority, although the Palestinians, by the way, by now are no longer the majority, as they were back in 1947, 48. 48, of course, being the year that Israel was founded. 47, the year that the UN voted on it. Okay. So the issue of self-defense is rather curious because the aggressor with a conventional military force, massive weaponry supplied by its allies from the United States to Western Europeans to non-Europeans, okay, that government claims that the civilians in Gaza and the civilians in Beirut, because among them in Gaza there is an organization which was set up as a resistance organization, namely Hamas, pro-Iran, and in southern Lebanon, Hezbollah, pro-Iran, right? Because of those, then there is license to strike civilian targets. Because the end result is civilians are the ones who pay the price. As the great Jewish American historian Howard Zinn noted, all wars, and I agree with him entirely, and there are many, many scholars who accept this position and have long before Howard Zinn, by the way. All wars are against civilians because they pay the price. They pay the biggest price. This particular war is one where civilians have been deliberately targeted. Not according to me, but according to the United Nations various sub-agencies. And this is a position that most of the world shares, by the way. Most of the governments around the world and most of the human rights organizations observing and analyzing what is happening on the ground agree with this position. Now, there is another issue here. And that issue, besides the issue of legitimacy, on the one hand, the UN affording legitimacy to the Palestinians, which would lead to statehood, the Israelis coming back and saying, we have the right to self-defense, as though self-defense includes apartheid, ethnic cleansing, and genocide, which it does not, by the way, because the fact is that the United Nations Convention 1949, the United Nations clearly gave its directives to Israel in 1949 that it has the obligation to protect the population in the Palestinian population, the population in Israel, which was relegated to second-class citizens, as we will see. So this is an important issue here. Now, the other one is the role of the United States. It is no secret that without the United States, Israel could not be doing what it's doing, because the US brings along its junior partners from the G7, NATO, and the G7. Okay, so the US drags its partners along. Okay, and allies like India. So what we have here is the very important role of the United States. The question is, why is the United States so adamantly concerned about giving a carte blanche, as many analysts have pointed out, including United Nations personnel, to Israel, no matter what it does, and no matter what the rendering of the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court have been, carte blanche to Israel? Why is the United States doing this? And that's another issue, and that's another dimension here. Let me begin by looking at the structure of the United Nations and delve into the issue, the structural issue, why the nature of the United Nations as an international organization itself precludes execution of the resolutions. And one of the reasons, by the way, that this week, the last week of October, while there is a meeting of the IMF World Bank in Washington, D.C., the annual meeting, there is another meeting of the BRICS, the China-Russia-led BRICS group in Kazan, Russia. And they have discussed the question of the UN's impotence, the fact that it's not doing anything to implement the resolutions, and that perhaps BRICS should be more engaged and involved in protecting the rights of the Palestinian people. The United Nations is really the child, the offspring of the League of Nations. The League of Nations was an American idea. It was founded when President Wilson went to Paris to negotiate the peace treaty at the end of World War I, which was called the Great War. He is the one who proposed the idea of an international organization called the League of Nations, intended to manage the global balance of power and preclude another war from taking place. However, the Treaty of Versailles, which included, of course, the creation of the League of Nations, was never ratified by the United States Senate. The US stayed out of the League. Although the US created the League of Nations, the result was that if the US was not a member of an organization that it proposed to create, why would the Europeans or anybody else take it seriously or invest in this organization? So the League of Nations was very weak from the start. A great idea, Wilsonian internationalist idea, by the way, in foreign affairs, in diplomacy, Wilson diplomacy is known as internationalism. He was an internationalist, which means he believed in multilateral approach to foreign policy, resolving conflict problems around the world through multilateral cooperation. In the 1920s, the United States, under 3 successive Republican presidents, adopted a unilateral foreign policy, which was camouflaged in the form of isolationism. The US became isolationist. It was going at it alone. It did not want multilateral engagement. This is a very important point because right now, and during the Trump period, okay, right now, of course, we have the election of 2024, but during the Trump period, and right now, when Trump is running again and could very well win again, the GOP right now and under Trump has been leaning toward Trumpian isolationism, neo-isolationism. This means that there is a segment of American elites in government, in politics, in the defense sector, among the business elites who are isolationists. They don't want the oversight of an international organization like the League of Nations or the one that succeeded, as we'll see, the United Nations. They want to go it alone. They don't want anybody else looking into their business, except when they need it, as we will see. In 1945, the US created the United Nations. It did so in consultation with a few other countries, mainly with Great Britain under Winston Churchill, by the way, during the 1940s, during the war. The United States created the United Nations. The United Nations headquarters are in New York City. Everybody knows it. It's New York, right? It's a UN child. It's the child of the League of Nations that failed. And one of the reasons that historians argue we had a Second World War is because the US never joined the League of Nations to prevent the excess powers from rising and engaging the rest of the world in a global war. You see, this is how important an effective international organization can be. So the United Nations was born in 1945. 2 years later, the United Nations recognized the right of Israel to create a state, but there was the agreement that the land known as the Mandate of Palestine under British colonial rule before that would be divided. The original division was 55% for the Israelis and 45% for the Palestinians. This brought about some friction with Palestinians, considering they were higher in the population. By the way, the population today is roughly equal. So the United Nations appointed a Danish uh, diplomat, a Danish intermediary. His name was Folk Bernadotte. He was the intermediary of the United Nations to decide the issue, to reach a compromise, by the way, um, on Resolution 181, the UN resolution, the 1947 UN resolution 181 was the resolution that divided Israel 55-45%. Now, the United States, I'm sorry, the United Nations representative, intermediary, the Danish intermediary who was trying to reach the uh, resolution, was the target of a Zionist terrorist organization known as the Stern Gang. It was a paramilitary organization. It was an organization that was devoted to using unconventional means, namely targeting individuals and groups, to bring about the creation of a Zionist state. So the Zionist state came into existence out of these sorts of tactics, out of warfare um, and such assassinations. So the UN and Israel, from the very beginning, never, from 1948, when the State of Israel was created, never had a good relationship. They did not have a good relationship because Israel refused to compromise with the UN on the division of land, or the two-state solution, a UN idea, by the way, a UN idea, the UN solution, to this day supported by the majority of the world. And the other issue is, of course, that the assassination of a UN representative was obviously against international law. It's against any law, but it was against international law to assassinate a um, um, a UN official. In 1949, the Geneva Convention, and I mentioned this before, the Geneva Convention clearly stated that Israel had an obligation. Israel had an obligation not to violate the human rights of Palestinians, but rather to protect the human rights of Palestinians. What do we have instead? We have the unfolding from 1948 to the present of an apartheid state. That is a reality, by the way. And we have the unfolding of an Israel that has visions of expanding territorially by removing as many Palestinians as possible. And a number of Palestinians began to leave, in fact, as they are to this day, have been leaving. The concept of Israeli Zionists was based on ethnic cleansing and greater Israel. Very hot topic today, by the way, in 2024, the concept of greater Israel because of what they're doing in Lebanon, namely in the name of going after Hezbollah, heavily bombing Beirut and targeting civilians, by the way, including United Nations personnel. The Zionist elements, long before Hezbollah began to operate in 1980-81. Hezbollah means the Party of God, and it was created after the Iranian Revolution. It's a Shiite group which is linked to Iran. No Hezbollah before the Iranian Revolution. Okay, no Hamas either. Both, let's keep that in mind, because as early as 1955, we now have evidence, we had it for some time, that the government of Israel had visions of a greater Israel. They had plans to annex southern Lebanon, in fact, to control the government of Lebanon through a puppet regime, either pay that government off or have that government enticed to be pro-Israel, and then to have north of the river, have the southern Lebanon region part of a greater Israel, but also dreams of greater Israel that included land from neighboring countries, from Syria, from Iraq, from Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and of course, uh, get rid of as many Palestinians as possible, in other words, through ethnic cleansing and the apartheid policies. All of this was ideologically influenced by a German concept of the late 1890s, late 19th century, late 1890s, known as Lebensraum. Lebensraum means living space in German. The concept of Lebensraum and the rise of the Zionist movement coincide. Lebensraum was the idea that the Germans needed living space as a new country. Germany, by the way, was created out of war, just like Israel, in 1870, under the auspices of the Prussian diplomat Otto von Bismarck. Lebensraum entails that the people who regard themselves as superior, because Lebensraum includes social Darwinist supremacist ideas, by the way, assumptions about racial superiority, those people have an obligation to expand, to take territory. From whom? From others who are already there, native to the land. In the case of Germany, by the way, Eastern Europe all the way up to Siberia. Okay? In the case of Israel, Greater Israel, as I pointed out, from the Palestinian lands and then all around the Arab territories, take as much as possible. So there is a parallel here between that model, the German model of Lebensraum of the 19th century, which, by the way, which was fully embraced by Adolf Hitler. It was at the heart of Adolf Hitler's foreign policy. Okay? So when you read, for example, books entitled Hitler Moves East, that's Lebensraum. So what we have here is a plan for a greater Israel. And who is in the way? First and foremost, the Palestinians. And who is trying to afford legitimacy to them? The United Nations, the Geneva Convention of 1949. Right? And the members in the United Nations that speak up. In the 1950s, the Palestinians found a friend in Nasser, the Egyptian president, who became one of the leaders of the non-aligned movement, which came into fruition by the early 1960s. Nasser, along with Nehru of India, with Sukarno of Indonesia, with Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, these people put together a bloc known as the non-aligned movement. Basically, a number of third world countries, what we would call today global South countries, used to be called the third world back then. Okay, so the non-aligned were pro-Palestinian. Okay, they were pro-Palestinian. And what happens at the UN is very important, because the non-aligned begin to have a voice in the UN. And after 1953, after the United States ends the war in Korea, okay, which divides North and South Korea, officially, what happens is that the United States loses, after 1953, it loses the support it enjoyed in terms of majority votes that it enjoyed from the Truman, I'm sorry, all the way from 1945 to 1953. In other words, throughout the Truman period and the first year, roughly the first year of Eisenhower. So that support was gone. After that, the non-aligned bloc was more leaning more toward the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc, as well as China, rather than the West. The United States at that juncture viewed Israel as a frontline state against the non-aligned, which to the U.S. they might as well be communists. Um, the U.S. many U.S. analysts, including government and military people, did not, by the way, did not distinguish between communists, whether they were in Eastern Europe, Soviet Union, China, Vietnam, Cuba. They were all one bloc, and then they began to lump together the non-aligned. They were all Reds. Okay, the kind of sophistication and sophisticated analysis that comes much later, partly by the end toward the tail end of the Vietnam War, ironically by a very conservative diplomat like Henry Kissinger, by the way, who figured out that nationalism transcends communism, and that's why he approached China, okay, and opened the floodgates for US investment, but also rapprochement between the United States and China during the Nixon administration. That's because he figured the obvious. He figured out the obvious, that nationalism did transcend communism for the so-called communist bloc countries, as though they were a monolith. They were not a monolith. And the same thing applies to the non-aligned. Now, Israel had found a thin veil, if you will, a mask, the mask of the Cold War. The Israel's mask of the Cold War was, we're on the side of the West, we're on the side of NATO. Look, we're surrounded by countries like Egypt, pro-Soviet, right? We're surrounded by suspicious countries, Arabs who are more non-aligned than they are pro-West. You can't trust them. Israel, a solid Western country. Besides, there is the racial element here. And this has been brought out by Palestinian and Arab scholars, including the late Columbia University professor Edward Said in his book Orientalism. There is an underlying racism involved here. The others, the Palestinians, the Arabs, are not like the Israelis, who are European. The others are non-European, right? So there is the manufacturing of the racial identity issue here. So there is that. And that goes a long way to identify them culturally, to identify the Israelis culturally with the West. And to this day, during this war, they have used this argument to death. They have argued that we are part of Western civilization, right? Civilization, to be used loosely, because this civilization has been on a tear of mass destruction, by the way, and it's continuing. While they are terrorists. Why are they terrorists? They want self-determination. They want national sovereignty. 18th century Enlightenment era ideals. Western at that. So how they dare embrace 18th century Enlightenment ideals of the West. Those are for the West. They're not for them. They are part of what used to be the colonial global South. They were colonies. and they were colonies, by the way. So there is a different way of looking at Palestinians than there is of looking at Israelis. A lot of Israelis have come from the United States, by the way, and Europe, Europeans and Americans, right? Now, the United States was also all along there to make sure that Israel was the vanguard in the Middle East for the Cold War. And the US had been pursuing a policy of making sure that the region did not um, drift away from the grip of the West. And that is until 1967. The 6 Days War, then in 1973, the Yom Kippur War. In 1967, what happened is the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, after the war was over and Israel prevailed and more territory was taken from the Palestinians, by the way, again, to realize the dream of greater Israel, the Palestinians carved out a deal that if they gave up the armed struggle and become a political entity, the UN would reciprocate and extend legitimacy to them as a political entity. Again, remember that Israel, as I said at the very beginning of this session, that Israel dreaded the idea that an international organization like the United Nations would afford legitimacy to the Palestinians, the same way that it did. Well, that it did to Israel, which recognized state member of the United Nations. Well, the fact is the UN did move in that way, and the UN began to the UN, especially the UN General Assembly, began, especially after 1967, began to issue resolutions against Israel, reprimanding Israel for violating the human rights of Palestinians. Now, from 1967 onwards, we have not just the General Assembly issuing resolutions of condemnation, reprimanding Israel, and asking that it observe the Geneva Convention and the human rights of the Palestinian people marginalized, that it abandon apartheid. But we have, actually, just for the record, the United Nations General Assembly and the Human Rights Council, what is now known as the Human Rights Council, issuing more such resolutions pertaining to Israel because of its violations with regard to the people of Palestine than resolutions of similar nature for the rest of the world combined. There are 195 countries which are members of the United Nations right now. Israel, all by itself, has earned more such resolutions of condemnation than the other countries. This is a matter of record. This is in the data bank of the United Nations archives. Now, the question is, were any of these resolutions enforced? Absolutely not. The United States was always there to protect Israel. In the Security Council, where it has veto power. Now, here's where I want to a little bit elaborate on the nature of the United Nations and why it has been so impotent. Because just like the League, if we look at why the US created the League of Nations, and the Europeans, by the way, went along with that reluctantly, but they did go along with the UN, and much more enthusiasm for the UN than there was for the League of Nations. Much more effective, by the way, the United Nations. The US was really interested in having an international organization like the UN, where it would go in, where it would go there and ask for support by the member nations and legitimize what it wanted to accomplish. The most, although they lost, by the way, after 1953, the majority vote, the most glaring example of going there to, although the US has had itself an inimical relationship with the United Nations, because the United Nations represents the concept of recognizing the national sovereignty of its members, which necessarily entails a sense of democracy. And if you are an imperial power, as the great William Appleman Williams pointed out in his book about the history of the United States, empire as a way of life, if you're that, if you're an empire as a way of life, you don't want a United Nations unless it's on your side. That's exactly what we have here. In other words, unless the UN was an appendage of the State Department, served the interests foreign policy interests of the United States and its NATO group and its allies, then what good was it, right? Certainly, the U.S. would not want a United Nations that was non-aligned or pro-Soviet, pro-China. Those are the enemies, right? So what we have here is the convergence of the goals of Israel and the United States and its allies. Therein rests the problem of the inimical relationship of Israel and the UN, and why Israel gets away with anything. Because the US is right there and it agrees. It agrees with Israel. Whether it's the Human Rights Council or any entity that criticizes Israel, the US is right there voting with Israel. Or if there's a resolution against Israel, the US will veto it. As they have historically, by the way, especially during this war, which the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court have deemed genocide. And international organizations say the same thing. When the war in Israel broke out, that Israel decided to carry out, by the way, it had a choice. It could have a diplomatic solution with Hamas, which, by the way, I want to stress, Israel helped to establish Hamas in order to make sure that the Palestinians were divided between the Palestinian Authority up in Gaza, in the West Bank, and down in Gaza, and that so that the two-state solution doesn't take place. And Israel, we have enormous amounts of evidence, was financing Hamas. So Hamas was in part in existence because of Israel itself, because it served the purpose of Israel. It existed because it was useful. It kept the Palestinians divided, supposedly. They're not, by the way. The Palestinian people are not divided. The goal is the same: popular sovereignty and national sovereignty. They want to have their own state. They don't want to live under apartheid conditions, ethnic cleansing conditions, and intermittent wars as they have. That's they don't want. On October 7th, when Hamas did attack Israeli civilians and did take hostages, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres stated that yes, this was an act of terror. We're against this. The UN is against it. It was its obligation, and it did the right thing in making that. Obviously, that's the UN. That's what the UN is there for. However, he said, there is a context here. History does not begin on October 7th. The Palestinian-Israeli conflict did not start on October 7th, 2023. It goes back in the mid-1940s. And there is a long history of apartheid and ethnic cleansing all the way back then. If you look around the areas of the around the surrounding countries, in other words, the neighboring countries, Lebanon included, you'll see that a lot of Jordan, a lot of Palestinians. Why? Because of the Zionist goal of implementing goal of ethnic cleansing, which means implementing Lebensraum, forcing out as many Palestinians as possible, taking the land through the settlements policy, financed, by the way, by Western capitalists, banks, and companies. This does not take place in a vacuum. All of this takes place because there was always enormous amounts of money behind all of this. Where did it come from? Throughout the Western world, from wealthy investors and institutions that invested and still do invest there. That's why there has been a movement, the BDS movement, the boycott and divest and sanctions movement, that Palestinians and pro-Palestinian elements embrace, because what they want is pressure on Israel comparable to the pressure on South Africa before Nelson Mandela, which was an apartheid state, and it had relegated blacks to second-class citizens, and they were the workers for the white elites. That's what the Palestinian BDS movement was aiming at. The United Nations, by the way, I should tell you, the United Nations, there have been elements within the UN, sub-agencies and rapporteurs within the UN, that had clearly spoken in favor of that as a pressure tool. Just as there have been elements within the UN agency, the larger agency, because the UN has sub-agencies and it has all sorts of organizations that work for it, and individuals. And these people, while the UN may not have adopted it as a policy because the General Assembly hasn't voted, the majority hasn't voted, the fact is that individual sub-agencies have embraced the fact that Israel has been systematically violating the human rights of Palestinians. That's part of the record. You can go to the UN archives and take a look at it, by the way. Um, the Israel, by the way, I should tell you, has during this war killed a number of UN workers, journalists, academics, doctors, um, humanitarian aid officials. All of this constitutes a war crime, not according to me, but according to the United Nations, according to the Geneva Convention of 1949. Killing these people is a war crime, just like killing children is a war crime. Arguing that we're going to bomb a hospital because beneath the hospital, we believe they're hiding, some of those rebels are hiding down there, or they're hiding some of their munitions. But in the meantime, above ground, we have medical staff and sick people and injured people, but we're going to bomb them. That is a war crime. Because while the target may be down in the basement, anything above that dies, is destroyed. And of course, when I remember when Israel hit the first hospital, complete denial, the Western media immediately sided with Israel. That's the other dimension, by the way, of the United Nations Israeli friction, antagonism, is the Western press. The Western press is invariably on the side of Israel. And this is the complaint that the great Edward Said the historian at Columbia University, by the way, he was Palestinian, Palestinian American, had the complaint he had is they never look at our point of view. They never ask us. And he looked at everything from the New York Times to news programs and so forth, television and so forth. They only ask their opinion. However, there's another war, Ukraine, and in that war, they look at the perspective. They look at that war from the perspective of the victims, which they, of course, believe are the Ukrainians, right? And after all, Russia did invade Ukraine. So they look at that war from the perspective of the Ukrainians, who happen to be white. In this genocidal war, the victims are not Europeans, they're not white. They're Palestinian Muslims. So that is the reality. And that's the complaint 40 years ago or so that Edward Said had about how the West uh, views the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That it's not just the U.S. covering for the United Nations Security Council; it's the media that covers for it. So there is a ubiquitous institutional cover. So the the average citizen looks at the institutional structure and very clearly sees that it's on the side of Israel, and that the other side is demonized, although they're the victims, by the way. Um, I want to say a few words about the um, the inimical relationship of the United Nations and um, and Israel when recently in the last few weeks when Israel decided to transfer the war, or rather add Lebanon to the war. And the question is, why would Israel do this? For a long time, it's no secret, for the last year, um, as long as this war, it's a little bit more than a year now, has been carried out. Israel was crying out that Iran is the enemy. It's Iran. Iran, by the way, had been advised by its sponsors, namely, especially China, by the way, but also Russia, to exercise restraint, not to take the bait on everything that Israel did, because Israel wanted a confrontation with Iran. And it's no secret that there is a well organized group of pro Zionists in the United States, which has enormous influence inside the government, but in the media as well, by the way, well funded by pro Zionist elements, which are adamantly against Iran and want war with Iran. Which war, if it takes place, by the way, could explode into World War III. We don't know. However, the lack of knowledge is scary in itself. Israel has nuclear warheads, by the way. Iran may not. I don't know. My guess is that they don't at this point, but they're not far from it. They may not be far from it. Okay. Um, However, they have enough firepower to wipe out Israel, wipe it out. And if it comes to that, it will be a global war, at least a very serious regional war that will be devastating, not just for the Middle East, because right there where the Middle East is located, it's between three continents: Africa, Asia, Western Asia, obviously, and Europe. And there will be devastation to three continents adjacent to that. So we're talking something very serious. Expanding the war from Gaza, which is still continuing in Gaza, by the way, make no mistake about it. If you read the newspapers or watch television, listen to the news, read online, you know that Israel is relentless. They want ethnic cleansing in Gaza. They want them all out. Officially, the United States, no, 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 you can't do that. But it's providing the bombs to enable Israel to carry out ethnic cleansing. That's a matter of record. It's also a matter of record that a number of State Department officials have quit. They resigned because the top brass in the State Department with the White House have covered up, have not been forthcoming to the public about the complicity of the level of complicity. Everybody knew there was complicity. The US doesn't hide it. It provides billions in foreign aid to Israel. By the way, not just military aid, but guaranteed loans as well. Okay. And there are private entities that provide um, enormous support for Israel. Banks in both Europe and the United States providing loans for the settlers. So you have basically Western complicity here. State Department covering up for Israel, although presenting to the world, we're for ceasefire. We want ceasefire. We're not interested in continuing this war. Right today, every single day that we read the news, the US is constantly saying, of course, we support ceasefire. Here we are. Ceasefire, it's almost the end of October, no ceasefire. Why? Because the US doesn't want ceasefire. No ceasefire, but green light to destroying as much of Lebanon as possible, theoretically to divide Lebanon, to realize regime change, exactly what the US has been doing around the world during the Cold War, by the way, to realize and post-Cold War period, not just Cold War, to realize regime change in Lebanon so that it would be some kind of government that throws Hezbollah out, as though Hezbollah is some non-entity. It's actually, it enjoys 40% of the support of the Lebanese population. It's deeply entrenched in Lebanese society. Those who know Lebanese history know this, right? Hezbollah is not some fly-by-night operation. It's integral to the Lebanese society. In any event, the other culprit here, besides the U.S. covering for Israel and U.S. and the UN constantly trying to hold its ground and say we're just trying to enforce the Geneva Convention of 1949, we're trying to enforce the UN resolutions, although they're not being enforced. Nothing is enforced because enforcement mechanism is lacking because the U.S. is not going to allow any of that, and its partners, by the way. So the war is continuing. But there is another element here, which leaves really a sour taste in one's mouth, so to speak. And that is the role of the Arab neighbors, from Jordan to Saudi Arabia, some of the Gulf states, Egypt included, and then a non-Arab Muslim country, Turkey. They talk a good game, but they have continued to conduct trade with Israel all along. Money comes first. So it's not just the US and its junior partners, it's also Muslim countries that have not done much at all, no matter what the rhetoric is. And whatever they have done as far as the rhetoric goes, it's out of fear that their own population will turn against them. This much is a reality. Fear that the people throughout the Arab world, from North Africa, okay, from Algeria all the way down to Saudi Arabia, they are afraid that their own people who will support the Palestinian uh, quest for popular sovereignty and national sovereignty, uh, the population, the Arab population, the Muslim population largely, is on the side of the Palestinians. It's the governments, utterly corrupt, by the way, undertake, utterly corrupt and undertake. Those are the ones that have not done much at all. Okay, so one can argue that this is more complex. It is possible that there may be a solution. It's possible there may be a solution through pressure of trade and sanctions and boycotts after the election in the United States. Once the Ukrainian conflict ends, this one will probably not be able to stand on its own. It will have to more or less be wrapped up as well. It's also possible the worst case scenario is nuclear war. That is Israel with a green light by the US hitting Iran hard with nuclear warheads if Iran unloads ballistic missiles on Israel and does enormous damage against Israel. Obviously, there's a worst case scenario and there's a best case scenario. The best case scenario is the two-state solution that many have embraced. In the meantime, the United Nations continues to do its job, which is to carry out the mission of uh, protecting the human rights of all people, whether they are in the northeast of China, the Uyghurs, who are Muslims, by the way, or speaking out against Chinese policy toward them, which, by the way, Israelis themselves and the United States and Americans and Westerners go. What about the way that the Chinese government has treated them? Not seeing the duplicity in such a statement, namely silence when it comes to criticizing Israel, which has done much worse, carried out genocide against the Palestinian people. This is not to excuse China, by the way, which has relegated, although China has tried to improve relations with the Muslim minority. This is not to excuse them, but there is no consistent policy in human rights criticism. It's human rights cherry picking policy. We like those people, so we like the Uyghurs because the enemy is the Chinese Communist Party running the government. We don't particularly have anything positive to say about the Palestinians because we like the oppressors. We like the apartheid Chinese state. So we're just going to keep it at that. And the Palestinians are just terrorists. The Uyghurs are not. The Palestinians are. So this kind of duplicity the world has gotten used to. It is very difficult to know where this is headed, like I said. However, and it's also very difficult to know, by the way, where the United Nations is headed. At the meeting in this last week of October of BRICS in Kazan, Russia, there was talk about BRICS becoming a more forceful voice in conflict resolution at the regional level, precisely because the UN its structure is such that it's based on an imperialist model of the 19th century, where the great powers determine, and in the case of the UN, of course, a unilateral superpower named the United States determine what this entity does or does not. I want to thank you for watching. By all means, ask questions, write comments, and I want to invite you to please join this YouTube channel. Assad, my very good friend Assad Alim, who is devoted to social justice and human-centered causes manages this channel. I would love for all of you to join this channel, become members. It's an educational channel. Thank you.